Berlinale Talents. I hope you already enjoyed some talks and films during this festival. And I hope you've already seen great work of great cinematographers. And today we are very happy to change the focus in this sense. And it is my pleasure to introduce to you our moderator, Peter Cowie, and DOP Caleb Deschanel.
Hello, hello. Mike's
very
good
very
afternoon,
bright.
everyone. Good afternoon. Caleb, you have had an extraordinarily successful career as a cinematographer and also as a director. You've been nominated 6 times for an Academy Award as Best Cinematography. You are part of what I would call the Bay Area aristocracy, the generation that grew up in the late 60s, early 70s with Francis Ford Coppola, George Lucas, Carol Ballard, Walter Murch, and with all of them you've worked during your career. And you've also worked with a wide variety of other directors, mavericks like Hal Ashby or Barry Levinson, and you've also worked with 2 German directors, Roland Emmerich in Hollywood and Florian Henkel von Donnersmarck here in Germany on that wonderful film which they call Don't Look Away, Werk ohne Autor. Don't Look Away, I don't think it's a great title, but it's a wonderful film and it's so well lit. So we're very happy to have you.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
Now, I think you got started when you were at university at Johns Hopkins. You met Walter Murch, and then Walter went off to USC in Los Angeles. And did he persuade you to follow him to become?
Well, yeah, Walter and actually Matthew Robbins, who is a screenwriter, and actually wrote Sugarland Express, which was Steve Spielberg's first movie. And both of them were at Johns Hopkins a year ahead of me. And we became really friends at Hopkins, and when they graduated, they went to USC Film School. And while they were there, I was still deciding what I wanted to do. And for the entire year that I was a senior and they were at USC Film School, they kept bugging me to come to USC Film School because they said, and of course in those days you had no idea that there was a possibility of a career in film, because first of all the unions were really closed, and but it seemed like a nice goof, to go there and make movies for a while until you figured out what you really wanted to do.
Well, we have a number of clips today from your work, but we have one surprise clip right at the beginning, which I'd like you to see. It only runs a minute and a half, but it comes from nothing less than The Godfather. So could we have the first clip, please? Well. Now, you and George Lucas had something to do with this, right?
Yeah, well, Francis needed all these shots of newspapers and things, and there are a couple of little things like spaghetti going in the garbage and things like that, but all the people stuff was done by my mentor, Gordon Willis, who I actually studied with before he did The Godfather, and I think partly because of me and Matthew Robbins, who had an internship with Irvin Kershner, who had directed a film called Loving, and then later directed one of the Star Wars movies, Empire Strikes Back, which is one of the best parts of the Star Wars series. So through me and Matthew and Kershner, Francis ended up hiring Gordon, who was my mentor. So yeah, we basically, George and I just got all these newspapers printed up and then just invented different shots of that. So it's not. It's a small part of my career, but that, and on Apocalypse Now, where I did a bunch of pickup shots later, it's a really great training because you force yourself to really study what was done when they made the film, and you can look at something on film and go, oh, I see how that was lit. I see, I figured out the lenses. I figured out, the sort of stylistic elements that would make whatever I do fit into what they did. So.
And as a result, you of course got to know George Lucas. You knew already, but presumably you got to know Francis more.
George and I went to school together at USC, so he was there. I mean, John Milius was there, and Randall Kleiser, and of course Walter and Matthew and Basil Polidorus, who became a wonderful composer, and you know, just there was an amazing class of people there, you know, at that particular time.
Because when you made your real breakthrough, as far as I think cinephiles like me are concerned, which was that year of 1979 with Black Stallion and being there, the credits on Black Stallion read like a Zoetrope Hall of Fame. I mean, there's Carol Ballard, there's Francis as a producer, there's you. And did you live in San Francisco at that time? Did you go up to the Bay Area?
It's funny because a lot of people have the impression that that we had moved to San Francisco with all our friends, but we didn't, because, you know, my problem at the time was that because I couldn't get in the union, I mean, I needed to, you know, to work. And I could work in Los Angeles, and there wasn't really a lot of work in San Francisco for a cinematographer, you know. But there were a lot of commercials that I could do, and educational films and things like that. So we'd actually, you know, we were beckoned to join everyone up there all the time, but we never really did it. Although I did a couple of, you know, later I did a number of films up there. I mean, after I did the Black Stallion, I did More American Graffiti, which is a sequel to George's first movie, American Graffiti. And we were based in San Francisco for that, and then later on The Right Stuff as well.
Well, the clip we have from the Black Stallion shows the shipwreck, and that presumably was a combination of a number of different setups, because you had underwater, you had the ship heaving around and so on. Was that a tough shoot, Black Stallion?
Oh boy. You have to understand that Carol Ballard went to school with Francis, and you know, at UCLA, where they went to film school, you know, Francis would always get the top award, and Carol would always come in second, and along with Jim Morrison and Raymond Zarek, who later formed the group The Doors, you know, and they were all in film school together. And so, you know, Francis, when he became successful, realized that, you know, Carol was a really brilliant director, you know, but a difficult person to deal with in terms of, you know, having to talk to studios and everything. So he bought the rights to the Black Stallion because he knew that that would be a really great film for Carol to make as his first movie. And so it was really Francis's doing, you know, that got Carol really started on his career. So yeah, I mean, it was both of our first films. So.
And you got the first of your many awards there, National Society of Film Critics,
right,
BAFTA in England.
But I have to tell you, because Carol would direct a movie like he was making a documentary. So he would set up a situation, and then you would film it like a documentary. So it was kind of like the way we worked together when we did educational films. You just sort of set up a situation, and then you film it. You know, you just find a good angle, and you know, you film it. So it wasn't, you know, I didn't get a lot of experience in terms of staging the way you do in a regular, you know, movie with, you know, bringing actors in and working with them for, you know, the blocking and all that. But it was a wonderful way of working. But because we did the second half of the movie we shot in Toronto, which is the part with Mickey Rooney and after they come back from the island, and we shot that first. And we were working with a crew in Toronto, which at the time mostly did television movies. I mean, there are a lot more features done now, but in those days it was mostly television. And television directors in those days, or you know, even today, had to be very efficient. So they were used to a director going like, okay, we got that. Okay, now we're moving on, we're gonna do this. And Carol was one of these people who would come out and go, let's do the boy feeding the horse, or and then he'd go like, well, where's Mickey? And he wouldn't even read the call sheet, so he wouldn't know what we were doing that day, because he just wanted to, you know, invent things as he would go along. And so they said, well, Carol, Mickey's an hour away in Toronto, and if we bring him out, we're gonna lose all this time. He said, that's okay, I'll just do some stuff with the boy and the horse, and we'll figure it out. So I was dealing with the crew who was really ready to rebel because they thought they were making just this crappy, children's movie that nobody would go see, and it was going to be really awful. And it was really depressing to be surrounded by really negative people all the time. And I was really ready to quit the movie, and my wife kept saying, "You can't quit. We haven't made enough money yet for you to quit, so we have to stay here for another couple." Anyway, I was complaining to the sound man, who was a guy, old-time New York guy named Nat Boxer, was like really crusty, terrific guy, had been in movies forever, and he goes like, "You young kids," because I was a young kid at the time, "you young kids all think making movies is about making art. Well, it's not about making art. Making movies is you start the movie and you finish it. And when you're done, maybe it's art, maybe it's not, and you don't know. If you start out thinking you're making art, it's going to be crap. So just finish the movie." And I go, "Okay," so I finished the movie.
Well, can we have the clip from the Black Stallion, please? Pretty complex lighting there.
Yeah, it was shot in a tank at Chinichita, and we had, the propeller of the ship was made out of styrofoam. And when it would spin around, if you watched it carefully, it was always sort of wobbly and everything. So in order to avoid anybody noticing that, we would always move the camera around so you would be fooled by all that. And, the film is always the boy's point of view, so it was really important. You were always at his eye level, and you're right on the sand when he's waking up in the island and everything. And in the tank, the way they did the fire is that they would have these gas jets underneath the water, and and I was in the water with an underwater camera, and we were right at the edge of the water, and we just to get that really close point of view with the boy. But when we would start the shots, they would release the gas, and the gas would start coming up. And I remember, sitting here with a camera, and there's a gas jet there, and the gas is starting. I could smell it. And the way they lit the fires, on the surface of the water, is that there was a guy in a boat, and he had a jar filled with lithium, and he would cut off a piece of lithium, which catches fire when it hits the water, and then that would ignite the gas. So, we would I'd be watching him, and he'd be coming towards us, and the gas would be going, and I'd go no, and I'd sort of try to get away, and then would sometimes explode in your face as they were going. So it was a pretty terrifying, experience to work on that. But yeah, we had these huge dump tanks, and I mean, it was like the biggest scene that I had ever done in anything, because I mean, up until then, I'd really only done, commercials and educational films and things like that. So it was really, but I had a great crew, great Italian crew, sort of helped get me through the whole thing. So it was pretty wonderful.
Now, on Sunday, you and I both attended the Dine and Shine event here, and I happened to be sitting next to a young cinematographer from Mexico, Daniel. I'm not sure if he's here, but he made an interesting comment to me, and I'd like to run it past you. He said he didn't like it when a cinematographer imposed his stamp, his look, on every single film he did. He felt that, in a way, he should adapt his style to the vision of the director. Do you agree with that? Do you think
Yeah, I think so. I mean, cinematography in a lot of ways, I think, should be really invisible. And lots of times when people talk about a movie, oh, it's really beautifully photographed, but the movie's terrible. I always have this disappointment of the fact that, when you film something, you're always hoping that the story and what you do with the cinematography is matching, so that you just accept it as being part and parcel of the whole storytelling process. My feeling about cinematography is that you are basically trying to find, sort of visual equivalents for what the emotion is in a scene. In one way, like when Stanley Kubrick made The Shining, there's a scene, there are all these scenes of Jack Nicholson typing and everything. You don't know what it is. And then there's a scene later where Shelley Duvall finally is going to see what he's been typing all this time. And she comes up and she looks down, and there's, a pile of pages like this high, and each one, it says, all work and no play makes Jack a dull boy. Now that, it's the equivalent of what you're trying to do as a cinematographer, is you're trying to find, and that visual equivalent is all work and no play, that just page after page, perfectly spaced. You see that and you go, Jack Nicholson's crazy. I mean, because that's a visual, sign that and so you're trying to find those elements, whether it's with the light and putting people in shadow, or whether it's the atmosphere, the weather, or, the lens choice of being close to a face. And, I would say a good deal of what you do as a cinematographer is knowing where you need to be in order to experience the performance of an actor. When we were doing the Black Stallion, there was an Italian actor who had a small part in the movie. He's in the scene early on where Kelly Reno, the boy's father, is playing poker, and the actor said to me, he says, I act with my eyes. And he was also wearing a hat, so it was really hard to, but it was really nice to have someone, an actor sort of tell you that that's kind of where because some actors are very physical and they represent themselves with their physical movement and everything. And for me, I'd say 80% of what I do when I shoot a movie, because most of what you're going to experience in the movie is through the eyes of the characters that are being represented in it, and you need to observe them and figure out what it is about them that really expresses the character that they're trying to get across. And it may be their eyes, it may be their body language, it may be certain physical things that they do, or the way they lower their shoulders, or there's so to be a great cinematographer, you have to be a really good observer, because that's where the communication happens, is in with the actors. And you're just really trying to give them something that pushes along that emotion that they're trying to express.
Now that dovetails nicely into our next film, which is Being There, which you shot very soon after that, because it stars Peter Sellers, and in an extra on the Blu-ray edition of The Party, which came out recently, someone reminisced that Peter Sellers was very, very pernickety. He would look at each take and say, no, I don't like that, I want to do this, and really get it absolutely right. Now, in Being There, he plays a character who is almost static. Very little movement. It's all in the look, isn't it? How did you work with him on that?
Well, Peter never was out of character. There were times when I would go to dinner with Hal and Peter was always Chauncey Gardner, even when we were having dinner. So, he was really strict that way. But he was really good at, he could imitate any kind of accent. And we were filming in North Carolina, in Asheville, North Carolina, and there was one point, we'd been there for like 8 weeks or something, and I was coming through, and there was a new guard at the gate, which is like 2 miles from the house, and the guy wouldn't let me through. And I said, well, you've got to call up, and because I'm supposed to be, there because I've got a rehearsal with Hal and Peter Sellers and Melvin Douglas, and they're waiting for me. And the guy said, I said, well, will you please call up? So he calls up, and I see the guard going, okay, yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Oh, yeah. All right, sir. Yeah, all right. And he hangs up and goes, okay, go ahead. And clearly he had been reprimanded by somebody, of great importance. So I get up to the house, and there's Peter and Hal laughing hysterically, because what had happened is the phone had rung, and Peter picked up the phone in a perfect, hello, yeah, in perfect North Carolina accent. When the guy mentioned my name and everything, he just started berating this guy for not letting me through. So, but Peter was really something really brilliant about him, and the performance. That film, is a comedy, but Hal and I decided when we shot the film that we were really making a film about power and politics and a very serious, important subject, so that the only way you're going to know it's a comedy is from Peter Sellers. So the lighting is very, the whole movie is very stated. I shot it with 2 lenses. I shot it with a 40 and a 75 millimeter. There's one shot I did with a 29 because I couldn't get back far enough, and one shot we did with a zoom. But the whole movie, and it's very simple, and it's very, almost Gordon Willis-esque in like The Godfather, where it's all pretty much eye level, throughout the whole movie.
Well, the clip we're going to show actually begins with a single shot of a glass window of a door, which could come from The Godfather. Absolutely, Gordon Willis. But just before we see the clip, could you say something about Hal Ashby? Because he was one of the great mavricks of the period.
Yeah,
Directed so many good films.
I loved working with Hal. I mean, I actually met him because when I was going to USC Film School, they had decided they were going to make some movies about people, in more technical categories like editing and cinematography and everything. So we were going to make a film. I mean, we never ended up doing it, but we were going to make a film about an editor, and Hal was an editor for Norman Jewison for many years and won an Academy Award as an editor. And so I met him there, and then we just kind of took a liking to each other. And then when I finally was able to get in the union, he was able to hire me to do Being There, which was the first Hollywood film I did, because even though I'd shot The Black Stallion and I'd shot More American Graffiti, Being There was the first film in LA with a real Hollywood crew and everything. So,
could we see the next clip then, please? Um, 3 years later, you had sufficient clout, if you can call it that, to direct your first picture yourself. Right. Now, how did that come about? It was called The Escape Artist. It was produced, I think, by Francis Coppola, and a lot of the regular zoetrope talent, like Dean Tabularis, Fred Roos on casting, and Doug Claiborne, worked on that film.
Right. Well, yeah, Doug had been an assistant director on Apocalypse Now, and then, we had done some pickup things on Apocalypse Now, and Francis had bought the rights to the book, The Escape Artist, and he gave it to me, and I really liked it a lot. It's sort of a wonderful story about a young magician who's sort of, really precocious and beyond, smart beyond his years. And, Fred is a producer who produced The Godfather and everything, but Fred started out as a casting director, and he was really wonderful. I mean, he's the one who came up with the idea of Mickey Rooney for The Black Stallion, because, he really thought about, in terms of the characters, like what in the actor's life, could sort of represent, somehow, could be parallel to what's going on in the character. And the character of Mickey Rooney in The Black Stallion was, a sort of has-been trainer who wants to make a comeback and everything. Yeah. And in many ways, his career as an actor was like that. So, he was kind of living that. And he as a result, he was nominated for that movie. He did really a great job. But, we had Desi Arnaz in the movie, and Raul Julia, and Terry Garr, and really, I mean, Fred was just really good at finding, great actors to play the parts. And there were, some, and of course, Griffin O'Neill, mm-hmm. who was Ryan O'Neill's son, who was really great. And, I mean, there was a tragedy later on that sort of, kind of ended his career, but because he was in a boat with Francis's son, Gio, and anyway, Gio was killed in this accident that Griffin was kind of held responsible for, so. Mm-hmm. Yeah, but yeah, it was really fun to do, and I had Ricky Jay as the advisor for the magic in the movie. And the reason why I hired Ricky Jay, I don't know if you know who Ricky Jay is, he just died recently, but he was, I mean, you can think of magic as tricks and everything, but Ricky Jay had done something that I had seen on a clip from a television show where he was doing sort of origami, and he was sort of tearing up pieces of paper and everything. But at one point, he sort of tore up pieces of paper and everything, and then, it was a butterfly, but then rather than being a piece of paper, it was a real butterfly that flew away. Mm. And I just thought that magic that goes beyond, the the idea of something being a trick or something, something that just leaps beyond that was really important, and it was something that was really needed in the movie, that you really believe, the magic is really magical, is really something wonderful. And there's a scene in the movie that kind of flashes back to, because what happens is the boy's father, who is a magician, is ended up in jail, and part of the movie is sort of this, real and unreal fantasy of sort of this, getting the father to escape from the jail.
But when you're a director, do you have the temptation to look over the cinematographer's shoulder? I mean, more than perhaps another director would, because you've done it yourself and you want to really be behind that camera.
I really gave it up. I mean, I was fortunate to have Steve Burum as the cinematographer, and Steve had gone to school with Carol and Ballard and Francis Coppola at UCLA, and then he actually had done second unit on Apocalypse Now, and he had also done second unit for us on the Black Stallion. And actually, when I first worked with Carol Ballard, it was on a film about a rodeo in Oklahoma City, and Steve was the head cinematographer on that, and he had much more experience than I had, and we had to light this huge arena to the point where you could shoot at 128 frames a second, which takes a lot of light. And he was setting these lights up, and I just had no idea how many lights it would take, and I was sort of watching him carefully doing it. But anyway, Steve, really, I mean, obviously, like any director, you look through the camera and you like a composition, or you don't like the shot, or you want a dolly or whatever. So, it's always a give and take. So it's not like I'm not participating in what he's doing as a cinematographer, but I'm not imposing myself on him. And when you're directing, there's a lot to do. I would say as a cinematographer, you probably answer 1 million questions in the course of making a movie, but as a director, you answer 5 million questions, and that's that's a full-time job. So I enjoyed having him be my cinematographer, because I really felt like it really freed me up to to just work with the actors, because there's nothing worse than a director paying attention to something other than the actors when you're making a movie. I mean, it's just because the other thing about working with actors, I found, is that you kind of have to be a different person with each different actor, depending upon what their needs are. I mean, some actors just, like Mickey Rooney, this is a very funny story, but Carol Ballard, like Mickey, but they would sometimes, get into a little bit of fight, because Carol would want to do another take, and Carol would start explaining to Mickey, "Now, Mickey, I really want you," and Mickey would go, "No, I know what you're going to say. Don't worry, and just roll the cameras." And we roll the camera, and Mickey would do something different, but not what Carol wanted. And so there was a scene where Kelly Reno, the little boy in the movie, is on a bale of hay, and Mickey Rooney is facing him, and he's telling the boy, "Okay, now you throw your arms out with it, and you urge the horse forward by doing this," and he's doing all this stuff. And then at one point, he kept grabbing the boy's hand, and he would squeeze the boy's arm really tightly, and the little boy would look at Mickey like that and everything. So anyway, 6 months later, Carol's in the editing room, and he says, "Here, come on in here, I want to show you something." And so, you're looking at the shot of Kelly Reno, and, he's taking direction from Mickey Rooney about how to ride a horse and everything, and then suddenly his eyes go like that. Well, if you have a close-up of somebody and their eyes go like that, you want to see what they're seeing. Well, guess what they want to, guess what you cut to when his eyes go like that? A close-up of Mickey Rooney. So here Mickey was sort of manipulating this scene so that he would get his close-ups by squeezing the boy's arm. I mean, that comes from a lot of experience from, the time he was 5 years old, acting in his first movie in 1927 or whenever it was.
Anyway, the year after The Escape Artist, you went to work with Phil Kaufman on The Right Stuff, and he produced your first Academy Award nomination. For me, this is probably the greatest film you shot, but it's particularly good because of your use of crepuscular light. You like to shoot, or perhaps Phil wanted to shoot at dusk and at dawn a lot, and that must be very challenging for a cinematographer. But we have a sequence here from the beginning of the film, fairly close to the beginning, which really shows the use of natural light, I think. Can we have that clip, please?
Well, we were fortunate to have Sam Shepard and Barbara Hershey because, well, Sam is a wonderful rider. I mean, he's a real cowboy anyway, so we were able to do the scene with him and Barbara. But yeah, I mean, there's sort of what happens is that he then has to fly the X-1, and he can't, when you get in the X-1, you have to close the door in a certain way, and so he has to get, you know, Ridley, who's his sidekick in the movie, to cut a piece of a broomstick so that he can use that to close the thing, because he's incapacitated on one side and he's going to go break the sound barrier. And there's a sort of wonderful moment that reveals Levon Helm, who plays Ridley, goes in and he cuts the piece of of the broom handle, and then he spins it around and everything, and then of course Levon Helm was the great drummer with, And
well, wasn't it Phil Kaufman who suggested that your wife take the part of John Glenn's wife?
Well, yeah. What happened was, the actress who was supposed to play the part, ended up backing out, and then Phil's wife, suggested Mary Jo, and Phil was actually wanted to give Mary Jo a small part in the movie. And so when when the other actress backed out, they decided, but then the producers all going like, what, you want the cinematographer's wife to be the part? And he said, yeah. So we did a test with Ed Harris. Now, the story of Ed Harris is, we have a friend who was teaching acting at Cal Arts many years before the movie. And we had just moved into our first house, and Mary Jo was like 9 months pregnant, and we decided, that we needed to have some painting done in the house. And our friend Gil Dennis, who was teaching acting at Cal Arts, said, "Oh, I've got a student, a wonderful actor, but he paints houses in the summer, with his dad and stuff. So he really is good, and he needs some money and everything. So we hire this guy, and he comes, and we wouldn't let him smoke inside because he was a smoker. So he had to sit outside. So, he would sit outside and smoke, and I'd go get a beer, and we'd sit together and talk and everything. So anyway, 5 years later, we're in the office, and my wife, Mary Jo, is coming in, and, she's going to have lunch with me, and then we're about to go out, and Phil comes in, he goes, "Oh, I found this great guy to play the part of John Glenn," and he shows us as a picture. We're like, "We know that guy, he painted our house. That's Ed Harris, So, so then, then it ended up, Mary Jo played Annie Glenn, but she had to, in the movie, she has to stutter. So in order to stutter, she actually joined a stuttering group to sort of listen to people and figure out how to stutter. And, so as a consequence of that, she would have people who were stutterers calling up to tell her about a meeting or something. And of course, she'd get on the phone, and she warns me, like, if somebody's on the phone who is a stutterer, you cannot complete their sentences. And so I would answer the phone, and somebody would go, hello, and I want to go, yeah, is Mary Jo there? But I have to stop myself. So she became very close with these people who were stutterers and sort of learned, how to do that. But I mean, many years later, Ed directed a movie about Jackson Pollock.
Yeah, very good.
And we happened to be nominated the same year, and we were at the Academy Awards, and I go, "You know what, Ed? I can now tell people that Jackson Pollock painted our house."
It was a good film. I liked it. Pollock was the title.
Oh, yeah, it's a really good movie.
Yeah.
He's a good director. But The Right Stuff for me was a really great experience because I grew up, my father was an engineer. He, first when I was younger, he worked for a company that made pumps for fire engines, and then later he was involved with a company called Flight Refueling that refueled planes in the air, and then he worked for Martin, you know, designing pumps for, you know, rockets and everything. And when I was a kid, when I was like 14, I used to build rockets, and in those days you could go to a pharmacy and you could buy potassium perchlorate and potassium, and I used to go to a pharmacy and buy everything I needed to make rocket fuels and stuff. I mean, I finally got stopped by my father when I got plans for a liquid fuel rocket that used fuming nitric acid and furfuryl alcohol, which are hypergolic fuel. By hypergolic, it means that when the two things come together, they catch fire. It's kind of like throwing the lithium on the, you know, in the water, it catches fire. So, you know, I had this 6-foot rocket I was about to build, and my father went crazy and said, "You cannot do that." So, one of these days.
Parts of The Right Stuff were shot at two of America's most famous aircraft bases, Air Force bases, and in the Mojave Desert, I believe. Now, as a cinematographer, the old question, is it easier to shoot on location or in the studio?
Well, I mean, if the location is, you know, is where it's supposed to be, I mean, then it's best. I mean, the thing about, you know, and it's something later which we can talk about if we have time to get to, you know, talking about The Lion King, where I had control over everything. You know, you schedule your day around the fact that the sun comes up in the east and moves to the south, at least in the northern hemisphere, and sets in the west, and you have to, maybe you're doing a scene that takes place over 10 minutes in the movie, but you're shooting it over a whole day. You then have to really schedule your day so that all those scenes, you know, all those different shots go together. But I mean, Edwards was great because, first of all, Chuck Yeager, who broke the sound barrier, was one of the advisors on the film. And at the time, I mean, I think he was in his 70s at the time, but he was still flying, and he would fly, you know, F-16s, and, you know, he'd go to, you know, Alabama or something, and then come back in the morning, and it'd be like a, you know, 20-minute flight at Mach 2 or whatever he was flying at. And one time we were filming at Ponchos, and all of a sudden we just hear this incredible sound. A jet goes flying over at about 50 feet, you know, and we all come running out of the set. We look up, and there's this F-16, goes up, circles around, and comes back down and goes right over us again. And 20 minutes later, Chuck Yeager shows up, you know, and we say, "Chuck, was that you?" And of course he denies it, you know, no, you can't. And you know, Chuck Yeager, you know, these pilots are very fatalistic and everything. And there was a point at Edwards Air Force Base, there's all the housing for all the pilots there, and they were all the hotshot pilots, you know, at the time. And you know, the streets are named after guys who got killed. And you know, and when you talk to the guys, like, you know, you ask Yeager about it, and he says, "Oh, those guys made mistakes. Those are guys who made mistakes." And it sounds really kind of callous, but then you start thinking about it, that in those days, before computers and everything, they would draw something on a piece of paper and then say, "Yeah, let's make that into a plane." And they would rely on these test pilots to see if it could fly. And you know, when you talk to Yeager, he's going like, well, they should have known. They should have been able to feel something in the controls, or you know, listen to the engine in a way and know, you know, because, you know, a great test pilot is a surviving test pilot, not one, you know, who gets killed. I'm starting to sound like Donald Trump right now, but I'm not.
And in the film, there is even a character who the Air Force employs to go around to announce the deaths to the widows, and Phil Kaufman told me that character was based on Death in the Seventh Seal, because he'd been so impressed by Bergman's film, Phil, when he saw it, that he thought that was a kind of little homage.
Played by Royal Dano, by the way.
Right, yes.
He's a wonderful actor.
Yeah. Now, your first, or maybe I'm wrong, but one of the first historical films you did, The Patriot, set in time of the wars.
Well, The Right Stuff is historical too.
Well,
not as
okay, but let's say the previous century, previous centuries was The Patriot, directed by Roland Emmerich, and again, an enormous amount of location work. And the clip we have is a typical action sequence, and involving a lot of costumed actors actors on horseback and so on. And perhaps when we've seen the clip, you could say what kind of challenge that was to film.
Yeah, I mean, we filmed it in South Carolina, and we actually were in places around Rock Hill, South Carolina, where you could stand on top of a hill and look around 360 degrees and see no evidence of modern civilization. And it was really great, you know. It was really, because you could really feel like you were in the period. And they hired these guys. All these guys, I don't know if they have them here, but you know, anywhere else in the world, but there are these guys who have uniforms and have muskets, and they go on these retreats with each other and pretend to be in, you know, Revolutionary War times or Civil War times, and they go camp out and everything. And these guys camped out for the entire, you know, several months of the production, and they lived in tents, and they built fires, and they cooked their food on fires, and so they were really. But you know, because you're going to show a sequence with fighting. I mean, the first battle that we did, we had trained these guys for like weeks at a time to be. I mean, you know, the American troops didn't have to be as well trained, but the people playing English troops had to be really experienced, because there was a real precision to the English army, that they would march in step and they would all stay. And you know, even after a couple of weeks of training, you know, we had all 9 cameras on these battles and everything. And then, you know, Roland and I looked at the dailies, and there would be these guys walking along, and then they'd sort of look at each other and walk forward. It was really hard to cut around that. So for the big battle sequence that happened at the end of the movie, these guys were trained for a good couple of months before, you know, just to get them to that point. You think it wouldn't take that long, but you know, to get the discipline of guys walking perfectly, you know, in step, it was really, really hard. I don't know why.
Okay, could we have the clip, please? All those flowers flying up. That was deliberate, obviously.
That's movie magic.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you know, some of the bigger battle sequences, we actually had as many as like 600 or 800 extras, but then those would be multiplied in the bigger sequences with the English troops into, you know, like 5,000 troops and something like that. And we shot all the big battle, not this stuff. These were like little skirmishes, but the big battle sequences we shot in 65 millimeter. And even though it was never, you know, blown up, I mean, it really makes a difference having a large negative when you create visual effects, because even though you reduce it, you still have more detail in the imagery. So it was really made a big difference when you had, you know, a big panorama of lots and lots of soldiers, you know, even though they're visual effects to add on to them. So we would have pockets of real soldiers, and then you know, at those different distances, they could then duplicate them.
Yeah.
And I mean, that was done in 2000, so you know, the technology has changed so drastically since then. But it was, I really enjoyed doing. I really liked working with Roland a lot. I mean, he, you know, Dean Devlin was his producer, and he relied on Dean a lot, just to deal with actors, because you know, his language skills weren't as great as Dean's, you know. But yeah, it was an amazing, you know, huge production to do. It was really, you know, I mean, you always get into these things and you don't realize how huge they are until you get involved in them. At one point we had this 80-foot crane that we sort of used to get these sequences of following the troops around and then turning 180 degrees and then seeing the British and then coming back around and then seeing the American troops and everything. It was sort of a wonderful way, because you know, you didn't want to be tromping onto the ground, so we weren't using it so much to get any height, but we're using it as a big arm to sort of swing in front of the troops and then you know, adjust the different angles behind them and rise up just a little bit. We would never be more than, you know, 10 feet above the ground, but you know, the arm ended up becoming a really great way to sort of be invisible and not, you know, ruin the set.
Yeah. Now, Roland Emmerich had established himself in Hollywood very rapidly in the 90s, whereas Florian Henkel von Donnersmarck has had a different kind of career. He made this wonderful film, The Lives of Others, about the Stasi in East Germany. Then he made this terrible film called The Tourist, which flopped.
Don't tell him that.
No,
He likes the
hope he's not here. But I thought it was terrible. And then suddenly came back to terrific form with Never Look Back.
Never Look Away.
Yeah, Never Look Away. Werke ohne Autor, which is based on the life of Gerhard Richter, loosely, the great German artist who is still alive. Born in 32, so what's he, 87 and 88, and it travels in time from the Nazi period all the way through to modern times, through, for example, the GDR, the way that an artist had to conform, and then how he flees to the West and so on. It was a huge production. It runs 2 hours, 50-something minutes.
It was 3 hours.
3 hours, minutes.
And 10 minutes, something like that.
How did he contact you? What film of yours had perhaps impressed him the most, do you think?
Well, boy, I met Florian because after he was, after he'd done Lives of Others and it won the Academy Award for Best Foreign Language Film, he became a member of the Academy, and he was actually on the Foreign Language Film Committee, and I was on that committee as well. And so we met each other and kind of knew each other, and he'd always really liked my cinematography. He actually wanted me to shoot The Tourist, but I couldn't. I mean, there's very complications, and I didn't shoot it. But I was, when he got the idea of doing this film about Gerhard Richter, he got Richter's permission to go spend, a month with him, and he recorded everything. And as preposterous as it may seem, 85% of the movie is really very much Richter's life. I mean, it's a pretty remarkable life. And before he actually wrote the script, he invited me to breakfast, and we went to breakfast at a little place in Brentwood, which isn't too far from where we both lived. And we sat down to breakfast at 9 o'clock, and he proceeded to tell me the story. And, when he had finished telling me the story at 1 o'clock, I mean, we were literally sitting there drinking coffee and having a little bit of bite to eat and everything, and it just kept going. And when he was done, I was like so moved by the story, I committed right there that, if he was able to write the script and get it going, that I would do the film. And, in the end, the movie's shorter than the story he told me, but by not a lot, but yeah, I mean, it's just a remarkable story, and the emotional journey of that movie, and the honesty of the characters, and the power of all the performances is just, it was great to be there every day. We were based in Berlin, but we filmed in Dresden, at the art school there, and we filmed in Düsseldorf at the art school there, and around the city.
Poland, a bit of Poland and the Czech Republic.
Yeah, we shot in Poland at a town that had been destroyed. It represented Berlin represented Dresden after the bombing in '45, and then there's some scenes that we did, after we came back later. To do some scenes with snow, and we ended up having to go to Prague because there's no snow in Berlin, and so we filmed there for the snow sequences, and also there's a scene in a gas chamber, where the girl Saskia, where the aunt Elizabeth is killed, and we needed, the actress needed to lose some weight for that sequence, so we came. It was like a hiatus of like 4 months, and then came back in January and went to Prague for the end part of production.
Now, when you shoot a film abroad, are you able to bring your own team, maybe a focus puller?
I've shot all over the world, and it used to be in the old days. I mean, even like the old Hollywood days, they would bring whole Hollywood crews and everything, and then. Generally when I would film in Canada or something, I would try to bring key people, like, my assistant and operator and the gaffer and electrician and everything. But over time, excuse me, over time I discovered if I could find local people in places, it was always so much better, because what happens is that when you bring someone in, the only crew they really can get are people who are not as experienced, because the crews work with the gaffer or they work with a grip, and they don't leave that gaffer or grip to go work with somebody from the outside. So you end up with people lots of times who are not as experienced. Now you can, and I've done this like in Montreal, I brought up my key grip, a guy named Dickie Dietz, who was, you know, one of the great Hollywood grips, who grew up learning all the tricks and, you know, engineering experience and everything that, you know, the great grips of Hollywood learned. Excuse me. No, that's a good idea. And I hired a local grip to be, you know, with him, and I figured, well, he's going to be excited to learn something. But instead, he was just really arrogant, and he just didn't, you know, he didn't pay attention to what my key grip wanted. So there's always this conflict that was really there. So when I was here doing, you know, Florian's movie, I decided that I, you know, would just get local people, and also the budget wouldn't really allow me to bring anyone in anyway. So, you know, I would just interview people really carefully, and, you know, some of the people I got were like really, you know, experienced, and some of them were younger, and some of the people who were recommended to me I would meet, and I didn't, you know, it's like the experience on the Black Stallion of having a crew that wasn't behind you and wasn't supportive of the story. There's nothing worse than having people, you know, who are, you know, kind of bad-mouthing you behind your back, or bad-mouthing the film behind you, not, you know, not really engaged in the movie. And so I ended up getting like the best crew here. I was really excited. As a matter of fact, I just had dinner last night with my assistant and operator and key grip. My gaffer, who was really wonderful, you know, Florian Cronenberg is doing a film away, so he couldn't be there. But yeah, we became really good friends, and I really, the great thing too is that they sort of introduce you to the sort of, you know, a real experience of being in the country as well, you know, because, you know, they have insights into, you know, what you need to see and what you need to do and where you can find things. It's really, I found it to be a great experience.
Okay, can we have the next clip, please? Now, you've been kind enough to bring along some footage from The Lion King, which was the big event for you the last 2 years, I would think, maybe longer. I'm not sure when you started, but perhaps you could talk us through what we're going to see that you brought over.
Yeah, I mean, there's some clips that's basically an edited, you know, montage of different things from the movie. But basically, the thing that was incredible about this movie is that it was sort of created in a, you know, we were sort of working in two alternate universes. One was this entire film that's created in the computer, with the exception of the first shot, which we actually shot in Kenya, and it was actually the first shot we filmed in Kenya. You know, we arrived on an afternoon, and then we flew around by helicopter and found a spot, and I used a compass that I used to use when I was a kid for sailing to see where the sun would come up, and we found the spot and marked it, and then the next morning in the dark came out and set up the camera with a long lens to get the sunrise, and the sun came up where it was supposed to. So it was kind of exciting, because I was afraid that if I used a compass on my phone that it wouldn't work in the middle of nowhere, because we were in the middle of the Masai Mara. So an old-fashioned compass was used. But the rest of the movie, you know, we went to Africa, and we spent a couple of weeks there filming animals and filming the locations and everything. And then that sort of became the inspiration for both understanding how we would film the animals and what the locations would look like, you know, the sort of serendipity. And, you know, the production designer was there, and Rob Legato, the visual effects supervisor, and Andy Jones, who is the chief animator, because all the animals are actually animated, you know, to look totally realistic, and some of the other people from the visual effects house. And, you know, and they would go around and they would photograph everything, rocks and grass and everything else. And then we went back to Los Angeles, and the production designer actually designed the Africa set, you know, and obviously the center of it in this movie, which is the Lion King, is Pride Rock. So Pride Rock was sort of the center point, and then off to the, you know, in this immediate distance was the watering hole, and then the Masai Mara, and way in the background was the elephant graveyard. And then separate to that was a desert that's kind of like the Sahara, and then, you know, the mountains which become the cloud forest. So it was an entire world. And then, you know, what would happen is you would cast the film, and in this case it was casting voices, and Jon Favreau, the director, who is also an actor, you know, would work with the actors, you know, actually on stage, and we actually filmed them. We had like 8 cameras around, and we filmed the actors. I mean, more particularly the Seth Rogen and Billy Eichner together, because they were just so, you know, they would just riff off each other, and their characters have such great life in the film. And then, you know, those performances then would be kind of inspiring to the animators as well. And then footage that we had shot of lions and, you know, elephants and everything else would become references for the animators. And then also online, like 8 billion, you know, YouTube, you know, downloads of people who've been on safari, and all that was the reference. So the idea was, and at first, well, the way I got involved is that John invited me to come meet him and talk about it, and I was really terrified it was going to be this, you know, sort of nerdy technical thing that would be like doing some, you know, analytics geometry class or something, and I'd be really bored. But he said, no, the reason I want you to do it is because of all your experience of doing these live action movies. I want it to look like, you know, the Black Stallion and Fly Away Home and all these other movies you've done. And, you know, and I said, well, how is that possible since, and he goes, well, you know, go with Rob Legato, and downtown at this place, Magnopus, they have some of the tools. So we go there, and they've got some leftover animals from Jungle Book, which, you know, John had done with Rob Legato. And so we had sort of a limited set of, you know, the African savanna and some animals and everything. And, you know, we would just go into 3D, and you were in Africa, and you could turn around, and, you know, and you could move, and your parallax would move and everything, and you could fly around with these controls. And so we actually just started playing around and doing some shots. And there's actually a shot in the movie which we shot like in that first day or two that I was playing around. It ended up in the movie. And I have to say, you were only limited by your imagination. And there was something really wonderful about it. So that, I mean, in a lot of ways, it's more like a perfect realm for, you know, doing your cinematography, because instead of having to follow the sun across the sky, you could actually fix it in different places. But paradoxically, you know, we would do a shot, and then we'd do another direction and everything, and I literally would move the sun in every shot. So it was almost as if I was experiencing, in a world where I could do anything I wanted with the sun, I would be moving the sun the way I would follow the sun on a regular day. And the you know, the film is structured in a way that it's a series of sunrises and sunsets and everything. So,
can we see the?
Yeah, I just show you, because I know unless you have little kids, or unless you have grandkids like I do, you know, you might not have seen the movie, so it'll just give you an idea. But the idea is, John wanted the animals to look absolutely realistic and move realistically and not do anything that they couldn't do in real life, except that they talk and sing. But other than that, the idea was to make them look as realistic as possible.
Okay, can we have the final clip, please?
So what would happen is that this existed in the computer, and you would, when the production designer created the world that we would be living in, we would go and we would location scout. And sometimes we started standing. We'd all be standing. It'd be, Jon Favreau and me and Rob Legato and Andy and the production designer James Chinlin, and we would be standing and talking, and you could move around and you'd be in different places inside the space. So you would have these controls where you could actually fly around inside Africa, But then inside the headset, if you turned, there would be these choices you could make, and there'd be like 5 helmets, different colors, and one would represent, the black was John, and I think red was Rob Legato and everything. And even though we'd be sitting next to each other, and John would be right next to me, but he might be at the watering hole, and I might be on the top of Pride Rock. And then he'd say, "Oh, Caleb, you've got to come and look at the watering hole. There's a really great shot if we were here low against the water for..." And then I could look up, and at his helmet, I would click his helmet and instantaneously be right next to him at the watering hole. And then we would line up shots, and then we had other controls where we could pick like an iPad, and we could take it and take a photograph, and then we could leave the iPad there so that later on when you come back to that location, you see the iPad and you go representing a certain shot that you might want to get. And as we would go around the location, sometimes the production designer had made hills too steep, and Andy, who was the animator, didn't particularly like that because it made it difficult to animate the animals in certain ways. So we gradually altered the space, to become what it became. And then, like in a regular movie, when you bring the actors in and you rehearse it, you sort of watch what's going on, and the director goes, "Oh, that's good when you sat down there." We did. So, John and Andy, the animator, would animate it, and they'd come up with a blocking for the characters. And then, I would come in with Rob, and we'd sit there and we'd watch it and go, it might be better if they go on the other side of the rock and everything. So then they would finish that up, and then that would become a file. And the way we were filming, like in a normal movie, an animated movie, you do one shot at a time. You do this shot and then this shot, and you maybe have a little bit of an overlap or something so you can edit. But this movie, we would then have a camera in virtual space, and we would have dollies, we'd have everything else, and we could mark where the dolly started. We'd have, you'd click on a flag, and that would mark where the dolly started, and I'd go over there, and I'd click where it ends, and then the computer guys would, and then they would hook it up on stage to our dolly track. And we would have a real live dolly grip, so that everything had that feeling. And I would operate the camera, or sometimes the Steadicam would be operated, so that there was always a feeling of a human being behind the camera, and everything is operated in a way that was very much hand, operated. The dolly grip would move a certain way. And even, when we first started, we would have the computer follow the focus. You could put a mark on an animal's nose, and it would always, wherever the animal went, it would stay in focus, the computer. But it always looked off, it was something mechanical about it. So I actually brought in my regular first assistant in Los Angeles, and he would follow focus, and it has the feel, I know, like when you see the mouse going up and everything, and it's like sometimes it's a little off, and we could always perfect it because we could repeat things just infinitely. But we found after a while that sometimes these little imperfections, would help an audience understand that it was really filmed live. It's not just, the quality of the animation and the quality of the finishing of the animals and everything. So we were on stage, in a real world, controlling the camera and the lighting and everything else in this virtual world in the computer. And it, I have to say that the thing that made it really wonderful was the invention that would happen. Like, for instance, you see the scene of Whim Away, which is sort of the end of the song, but it goes on for a really long period of time. And we had an area that was maybe 25 feet by 25 feet, like 8 meters by 8 meters or whatever. And, you know, for the Steadicam that had Optitracks that would read the LED lights on top of the Steadicam. There was no camera, but it represented a camera. But if you went more than 25 feet, you could multiply the moves by maybe 2 and make it look like 50 feet. But we had this long scene, and I really wanted to get it in one shot. And, you know, we started thinking about it, and then I thought, well, wait a second. What if we take the floor that the Steadicam is on, and in virtual space, we hook it up to the dolly, and the dolly is now, you know, going down the hill. So you have the entire platform with the Steadicam going down the hill with the animals, while the Steadicam can just move in and out and get close-ups and then come back, and he doesn't have to, but, you know, then you have to work out this incredible choreography between, you know, the dolly grip and the Steadicam, and, you know, where the Steadicam would go, no, you slow down and I'll do this move here. And so we were really doing like a very complicated choreography in a lot of these scenes to get the kind of things that we wanted to get. So it was pretty amazing.
Well, Caleb, we now have only very few time for a couple of questions, but you've almost answered all the questions during this period. So, but there is time for a couple of questions, and if you can wait for the mic, are people with mics?
Yeah, and then, you know, when we're done at the end, I'll show you, I have more of this clip that shows behind the scenes, so anybody who wants to stay after the time limit, you can do that.
Okay.
Hello. I have 2 small questions. One is like, how was the transition from film to digital, and how that changed our workflow and
Filming from film to digital?
Yeah, and creative decisions, and how much of an impact that has. And the second was like from digital to virtual, how that like, you could use like hypothetical lenses, like, I don't know, a 100mm f1 or something, or like because you said you were trying to make things really grounded and real, but if there was like things that you did that you could only do in this virtual world.
Yeah, you know, going from film, I mean, I resisted going to digital for a long time because I thought the really early, like, red camera was so terrible. And, you know, I mean, now we finally got to the point where digital is, you know, pretty much close to what you can get on film. And, you know, it's how you film it. And listen, it's inevitable that, you know, film is going to disappear at some point. I mean, you know, despite Quentin Tarantino and, you know, Chris Nolan, I mean, it's, you know, we tried on Never Look Away, we tried to shoot on film. And we actually did, the producers were against it because, you know, it's much more complicated with, and there were no labs in Germany. There is a lab in Berlin, but they weren't, you know, consistent enough. But the 2 ARRI labs closed down before we started filming, and the closest lab was in Vienna. And we actually shot some tests, and we sent film to Vienna, and we were still happy with it. And then a week or 2 weeks later, we were going to do some more tests on film and send it to the lab in Vienna, and we called them up, and they said, don't bother, we just went out of business. So it became inevitable that we would shoot Never Look Away in, you know, in digital. And, you know, in the end, I was pretty happy. I mean, I'm you know, as long as the quality is there, and I mean, you know, now there's a larger format, so you get a good feeling of depth of field and everything. But as far as going into the world of you know, a complete VR, you know, sort of alternate reality, it was designed by Rob Legato and by the people at Magnopus to be very much like what I was used to. So when I went into space, I actually had, you know, a choice of, you know, everything from a 14mm to 1000mm. And, you know, and we would restrict this to some extent in not, you know, because you could do almost anything, but we wanted it to have the feeling of, you know, what it would be like if we were actually filming live animals. And at first, I mean, John, when I was first talking to John, I mean, he was sort of thinking it was like long lenses, like the old-fashioned documentaries in Africa where you have, you know, wild animals at great distance because you can't get that close to them. But then when we went to Africa, we had lions come as close as you could imagine. I mean, it was really, you know, so we realized that was important. And then we looked at a lot of modern documentaries like, you know, Planet Earth 2 and things like that. And they do things that are just unbelievable now. So we kind of felt like that gave us the freedom to, you know, to be much more, give us a lot more freedom to do things that we really wanted to do in the film. Because, you know, it's as subtle as it is, and having animals not behave in any ways that's not like an animal, you know, they're expressions, and you read into them. And, you know, it may be that we project ourselves into it, just the way people watch cat films, and, you know, they see their dog and they go, oh, he loves you, or whatever, you know. And, you know, you have these things that we project onto these animals. But the animators did such an amazing job of finding, you know, expressions and you know, head movements and eye movements that really expressed a lot, and it was really remarkable.
Caleb, I'm changing my mind. I think it might be wise for everyone to see what you brought and see this, and then afterwards, those who want to ask you a few questions can gather around you outside.
Yeah, that'd be fine.
And that way they can clear the room afterwards.
Yeah, well, so the first part is silent, and then there's a section at the end that shows me actually working with a dolly grip and everything to get some shots, and then it's sort of put together. But the beginning part, you're going to see Jon Favreau and me, and we're sort of location scouting, and then we talk about, you know, designing shots. And there's actually a scene where we had, you know, we brought a drone into our space that was in Optitrax, and, you know, we were convinced, I was convinced that we would have to go outside and figure out another way of doing it, because the drone was only flying, you know, something like, you know, across the diagonal, maybe like 50 feet, and that was being multiplied into a quarter of a mile. But the drone, we had a real professional drone pilot, and you'll see the shots that we got with that. So,
Okay, can we have the final material, please?
just some idea of what, you know, it was like on the stage every day.
Caleb, it's been a wonderful afternoon. We really have to vacate the room now, but maybe outside you could continue to hold court. Sure. It's been a terrific privilege, and what a great journey from shooting Terrence Malick's first student film all the way to manipulating all this virtual reality on a huge studio in Hollywood. Thank you for sharing your wisdom with us.
And in the end, it's all the same storytelling, you know. No matter what, if you're not telling a good story, it doesn't really matter, you know, whether it's with a little 16mm camera or in virtual space, you know, it's all about the story. So,
well, thank you so much for coming. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Wonderful. Beautiful.